It was Memorial Day weekend, 1996. The campus of California Polytechnic State University, better known as Cal Poly, was buzzing with students celebrating the unofficial start of summer. Among them was Kristen Smart, a vibrant 19-year-old freshman majoring in communications. She was tall, athletic, and had dreams of becoming a reporter. That Friday night, she left her dorm to go to an off-campus party, a night that would mark her final known steps. At the party, Kristen was reportedly intoxicated and disoriented. When she left around 2 a.m., 3 students accompanied her, but along the walk back to campus, the group split. One student, Paul Flores, offered to walk Kristen the rest of the way to her dorm. He was the last person seen with her, but Kristen never made it to her room. She never showed up for class. She didn't contact her family. By Sunday, her parents were frantic. By Monday, they were on campus. And by Tuesday, she was officially declared missing. But the trail was already growing cold. Act 2. A case mishandled. From the very start, the investigation was riddled with missteps. Campus police initially treated Kristen's disappearance as a case of a student who had simply taken off for the weekend. Hours turned to days, and the delay in launching a proper investigation would haunt the case for years. Suspicion quickly turned to Paul Flores. He had a black eye the morning after Kristen vanished. His story about how he got it changed multiple times, first claiming it was from playing basketball, then later saying he hit his head on a car. But despite his inconsistent accounts, Paul was never arrested. He refused to take a polygraph and eventually lawyered up. Searches of his dorm room were delayed and ultimately yielded nothing. And when cadaver dogs were brought in, months later, they reportedly alerted to the scent of human decomposition in his room. But again, without a body, there was no arrest. Kristen's family was devastated, not only by her disappearance, but by the system that failed her. Her parents, Stan and Denise Smart, became relentless advocates for justice, turning their grief into determination. They held vigils. They spoke to the media. They never gave up. Act 3, the podcast that reopened the case. For over 2 decades, Kristen's case went cold. Then in 2019, something changed. A podcast called Your Own Backyard, hosted by Chris Lambert, breathed new life into the case. Lambert, a musician turned amateur journalist, began his own investigation. He interviewed witnesses, uncovered details the public had never heard, and kept Kristen's name in the spotlight. The podcast went viral. Suddenly, people were talking. Witnesses who had stayed silent for years came forward. New tips were called in, and behind the scenes, a renewed investigation was unfolding, quietly and carefully. By 2020, the San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Office had served dozens of search warrants. They dug up Paul Flores' father's backyard. They found electronic devices, buried evidence, and for the first time, real traction. ACT 4, Justice, finally. In April 2021, the unthinkable happened. Paul Flores was arrested and charged with Kristen Smart's murder. His father, Ruben Flores, was also arrested as an accessory, suspected of helping to hide Kristen's body. The trial began in 2022, and the evidence, though circumstantial, was damning. Witnesses testified that Paul Flores had a reputation for sexually harassing women. Cadaver dogs had hit on spots near his home. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed anomalies under the deck at Ruben Flores' property. And perhaps most chilling, investigators believed Kristen had been buried there for years, only to be moved when suspicion arose. In October 2022, Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Ruben Flores was acquitted, but for Kristen's family, the conviction of Paul was the moment they had been waiting for over 26 years. Epilogue, a legacy of persistence. Kristen Smart's remains have never been recovered, but her name now stands for more than tragedy. It represents the power of never giving up. Her parents created the Kristen Smart Scholarship to honor her memory, and the podcast that helped change everything, Your Own Backyard, became a blueprint for how citizen journalism and community persistence can help crack even the coldest cases. Title, Trapped in the Lab, The Murder of Annie Lou. ACT, A Promising Future. It was September 8, 2009, just days before her wedding. Annie Lou, a brilliant 24-year-old doctoral student at Yale University, walked into the Yale Medical Research Facility at 10 Amistad Street in New Haven, Connecticut. She was working on cutting-edge pharmacological studies, balancing academic pressure and excitement over her upcoming marriage to her college sweetheart, Jonathan Wadowski. She entered the lab at 10 a.m., swiping her ID card as usual. But this time, Annie never walked out. Her phone, wallet, and ID were found in her office. But there were no signs of a struggle and no signs of Annie herself. Act 2, Locked In. At first, police thought she might have gotten cold feet before her wedding. But those who knew Annie dismissed the theory. She was excited. She was in love. She was highly responsible. Investigators quickly zeroed in on the lab. The building was secure, entry required a Yale ID, and all movements were logged. A review of surveillance footage showed her entering the building, but there was no footage of her ever leaving. That was the chilling clue. She was still inside, somewhere. Act 3. The gruesome discovery days passed. As investigators combed through the building, suspicion grew that Annie hadn't disappeared. She had been killed and hidden in plain sight. On September 13, 2009, the day she was supposed to get married, police made a grim discovery. Inside a crawl space behind a wall in the lab's basement, they found Annie's body, stuffed behind a utility panel inside a chase where cables and pipes ran. She had been strangled to death. Her white lab coat was nearby. Blood and DNA were recovered from various surfaces around the lab and clothing. Act 4. The killer within. The building was locked. The killer had to be someone with access, someone trusted. DNA, security logs, and surveillance narrowed the field down to a handful of employees and researchers. But one person stood out. Raymond Clark III, a 24-year-old animal lab technician, responsible for cleaning cages and ensuring the lab met hygiene protocols. He had been seen on surveillance moving around suspiciously after Annie's disappearance. He had injuries, scratches on his chest, believed to be defensive wounds from Annie. And crucially, his DNA was found on Annie's body and her clothing. On September 17, Clark was arrested and charged with murder. Act 5. Justice served. Clark initially pleaded not guilty, but in 2011, faced with overwhelming forensic evidence, he took a plea deal, admitting guilt to the murder and attempted sexual assault of Annie Lou. He was sentenced to 44 years in prison. Investigators believe the crime was sexually motivated, though Clark never fully explained his motives. It was likely a moment of impulsive violence, possibly triggered by an argument or assertion of power, in a setting where he felt invisible, a lab worker, overlooked and under pressure. Epilogue. Remembering Annie Lee was more than a crime statistic. She was a young woman of Vietnamese descent, raised in California, known for her intelligence, humor, and drive. She had written articles about women in science and the safety of students on campus, an irony that haunts the case. Yale created new protocols around lab safety and ID access. The tragedy sparked national conversations about workplace violence, campus security, and the hidden dangers that can exist even in the most prestigious institutions. Annie never got to walk down the aisle, but her memory lives on, not just as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a brilliant young scholar whose future was stolen.